His steed collapsed first. A single arrow, perhaps two, pierced the animal's flank. Instantly, the Islamic world's most formidable sultan found himself on the ground. He lay in the dirt, under the cloak of night, amid the wooded hills above the Sabubuk plain, encircled by soldiers specifically stationed there to thwart any escape. This was the man known as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, Sultan Bayezid I, the inaugural ruler of the Ottoman Empire. The very leader who, in 1396, effortlessly crushed a pan-European crusade at Nicopolis as if it were a minor chore. The sovereign who kept the Byzantine emperor of Constantinople pleading for terms for years, witnessing his venerable city slowly succumb to an Ottoman blockade. 13 years on the throne, with an unbroken string of victories in every major engagement. A record that, by the standards of his era and region, was almost unparalleled until this very day. Within hours, Bayezid would be brought before Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror who had devastated Delhi, constructed towers from human skulls outside Baghdad, and moved his army across the land like an unstoppable force of nature, leaving only silence in his wake. Bayezid would be shackled before his vanquisher. According to tales that echoed through centuries of history and lore, he would eventually be confined within a gilded cage, paraded as a trophy, much like an exotic creature in a traveling menagerie. He was the sole Ottoman Sultan ever captured alive by an adversary. Consider that for a moment. The Ottoman Empire endured from approximately 1299 to 1922, spanning over 600 years, featuring dozens of sultans and hundreds of wars across 3 continents. Yet, throughout that entire span, across all those conflicts, only one sultan was ever taken prisoner. This man, on this particular day. On the parched plains of central Anatolia, under the oppressive heat of a July afternoon in 1402. So, what truly unfolded? How did the Mediterranean's most dominant ruler suffer complete and utter annihilation in a single afternoon? How did an army of 85,000 men, seasoned veterans, elite infantry, the finest soldiers of their generation, disintegrate so thoroughly that their sultan ended up on foot in a darkened forest with nowhere to go? This is the question that I repeatedly return to, the one that makes this battle genuinely captivating rather than merely tragic. Why did none of this have to happen? Because it didn't. There were several junctures throughout that day when different decisions could have led to an entirely different outcome. Moments where Bayezid might have survived, reorganized, and fought another day, where the battle could have been a painful setback instead of a civilization-threatening catastrophe. He spurned every single one of those opportunities. Each time an escape route materialized, he chose to remain. That is what we will dissect today. Every error, every betrayal, every critical juncture where history diverged and Bayezid chose the wrong path. We will explore Timur's military genius, certainly, but we will also examine the political decay within the Ottoman army that Timur exploited with devastating precision. We will delve into Stefan Lazarević, the Serbian prince who fought more fiercely for his Ottoman overlord than any Ottoman soldier, and who offered Bayezid an escape route 3 separate times, only to be rejected each instance. We will analyze the moment when an entire contingent of Ottoman soldiers crossed the battlefield and defected to the enemy's side while the fight was still raging. And we will consider the implications of it all for Constantinople, for Europe, and for the Ottoman Empire, which somehow clawed its way back from near total destruction to reign for 5 more centuries. This is the Battle of Ankara, 1402. One of the most dramatic, psychologically profound, and impactful military disasters in the medieval world. Stay tuned. To grasp Ankara, you must first comprehend Bayezid. Not just his accomplishments, but his psychological makeup, his personality as a man molded by specific experiences into a particular and ultimately ruinous set of reactions to the world. For his character is not merely a backdrop to this narrative. It is a direct cause of the outcome on that battlefield. Remove his personality, and you have a tale of a larger army defeating a smaller one. Keep it, and everything makes a different kind of sense. Bayezid I ascended the Ottoman throne in 1389 under already tumultuous circumstances, which immediately intensified. His father, Murad I, was assassinated at the Battle of Kosovo, reportedly stabbed by a Serbian nobleman who had feigned surrender to get close enough to strike. Bayezid was present. He witnessed his father's death, and within hours of becoming sultan, he ordered the strangulation of his own brother, Yaqub, not out of personal animosity, but as a matter of policy. The Ottoman succession during this period followed a brutal and straightforward logic. Eliminate all rival claimants immediately before they could become the focal point of a rebellion. The path to the throne was a stark choice: claim it or perish in the attempt. There was no comfortable retirement, no benevolent exile, no compromise that allowed a potential challenger to survive. This was the environment in which Bayezid was forged. Governing involved brutality, and survival demanded ruthlessness. By the standards of his era, Bayezid was exceptionally adept at navigating this dangerous landscape. Starting in 1389, Bayezid demonstrated an unrelenting, almost compulsive drive for expansion. He eschewed consolidating his inheritance, opting instead for immediate and continuous growth. He pushed westward, deepening Ottoman influence across Bulgaria and Wallachia, solidifying control throughout the Balkans. Concurrently, he moved eastward, systematically dismantling the small Turkish principalities, known as beyliks, which had dominated Anatolia since the Seljuk Sultanate's collapse in the early 14th century. These beyliks had enjoyed semi-autonomy for decades, some having been nominal Ottoman vassals. Bayezid, however, had no interest in mere nominal allegiance. He sought direct authority, replacing their rulers, incorporating their territories, installing loyal administrators, and unequivocally signaling the end of Anatolian self-governance. The strategic rationale was compelling. A fragmented Anatolia represented a perpetual vulnerability, a collection of minor powers susceptible to manipulation by external adversaries, draining Ottoman military resources through incessant minor uprisings and providing unreliable taxation or manpower. Bayezid required a unified, centrally managed hinterland to project power into Europe without constant apprehension about threats from behind. His vision was clear, though its implementation was savage. He dispossessed rulers, executed those who resisted, and dispersed their families. It is crucial to understand the nature of the beylik system, as the political ramifications of Bayezid's destruction of it ultimately fueled the betrayal that determined the battle's outcome. The beyliks were small Turkic principalities that had emerged to fill the power vacuum following the Seljuk decline. Their military forces were not mercenaries, but local military aristocracies deeply embedded within specific regions. Their identities were intrinsically linked to particular lords and territories. When Bayezid eliminated these lords and absorbed their lands, he acquired manpower without allegiance. He gained bodies but not commitment, seemingly believing these were one and the same. He was mistaken. Then came Nicopolis in 1396. This battle significantly shaped Bayezid's psychological state by the time Timur arrived. The Crusade of Nicopolis comprised a coalition of Hungarian, French, Burgundian, German, and Hospitaller forces advancing south with the aim of expelling the Ottomans from the Danube. They marched with considerable confidence, openly discussing the liberation of the Holy Land. They laid siege to the Danube fortress of Nicopolis. Bayezid appeared and systematically crushed them. The French knights, valiant and seasoned but inherently incapable of executing any coordinated plan, charged the Ottoman lines prematurely, stumbled into a prearranged trap, and were largely slaughtered or captured. The rest of the coalition crumbled around them. Thousands of knights were ransomed for immense sums. The crusade became one of the most thoroughly humiliating episodes in the extended history of Western military ventures. Following Nicopolis, Bayezid wasn't merely confident. He had ascended to a level beyond ordinary assurance, a realm where accumulated evidence of his own invincibility made any contradiction seem almost inconceivable. He resumed his stranglehold on Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor, Manuel II, endured a spectacular humiliation, at one point being compelled to sit in the Ottoman court and observe Bayezid adjudicate disputes between Byzantine claimants to his own throne. The Emperor of the Romans, the theoretical successor of Augustus and Constantine, found himself in a Turkish tent, awaiting a Muslim sultan's decision on who should govern his empire. This exemplified Ottoman dominance in 1400. Now, regarding Timur, you are already familiar with him, and I will keep this concise as this audience does not require his biography. What is pertinent to this narrative is the specific juncture and the particular tension between these two figures. By 1400, Timur had forged an empire stretching from Anatolia's eastern frontier to the borders of India. During his campaigns across Persia and the Caucasus, he had incorporated several Anatolian principalities as tribute-paying vassals, many of them the very beyliks Bayezid had dispossessed. The surviving, displaced emirs had sought refuge at Timur's court, where they had every motive to advocate for a war against the Ottomans. Timur, in turn, had an eager audience of well-informed sources highlighting widespread resentment toward Ottoman rule and detailing precisely how a Western campaign could exploit this discontent. The diplomatic catalyst was almost artfully straightforward. Both rulers asserted rights to tribute from the same minor states. Bayezid was imposing levies on Timur's vassal territories, which Timur viewed not merely as a territorial dispute, but as a direct affront to his personal authority. Their written communications depict two highly arrogant figures challenging each other, escalating through mutual insults towards an unavoidable clash. Timur demanded the return of individuals Bayezid was harboring, specifically Sultan Ahmed of Baghdad and Kara Yusuf of the Black Sheep Turks. Bayezid declined, citing obligations of hospitality, a refusal that was both principled and intentionally provocative. Timur's initial substantial action occurred in 1400 when he sacked Sivas, a vital Ottoman city in eastern Anatolia. He captured it, executed its military defenders, razed its fortifications, and departed, sending a clear message: "I can reach you. What will you do?" Bayezid's response was to persist in his siege of Constantinople, daring Timur to advance further west. This non-committal stance set the stage for the conflict on the Kubuk Plain. Timur's actions in the weeks preceding the Battle of Ankara showcased not merely skillful generalship, but a level of strategic military thought that Bayezid had never encountered or been prepared to counter in his entire career. Crucially, Timur wasn't primarily focused on the battle itself, but on shaping the circumstances surrounding it. He meticulously constructed a situation where the outcome was virtually sealed before the first Ottoman unit reached the Kubuk Plain. By summer 1402, Bayezid was still occupied with military campaigns in the Balkans. Timur gathered his entire available army, approximately 140,000 men, predominantly mounted cavalry, augmented by 32 war elephants from his Indian campaign, and advanced into Anatolia from the east. Regarding troop numbers, medieval records show Timurid forces ranging from 800,000 to 1.6 million, numbers modern historians largely dismiss as logistically unfeasible. Credible estimates, derived from logistical analysis and cross-reference sources, place Timur's army at approximately 140,000 against Bayezid's 85,000. This numerical advantage was significant, roughly 1.65 to 1 in Timur's favor, yet not so overwhelming as to guarantee victory outright, as armies have triumphed against worse odds. What made this numerical disparity catastrophic was Timur's masterful manipulation of the specific conditions under which these forces would engage. His first strategic move was to lay siege to Ankara. This was the pivotal cornerstone of the entire campaign, brilliantly simple in its execution. Ankara was no ordinary city. It served as the administrative and military linchpin of Ottoman Anatolia. Its capture would signal vulnerability to every vassal state, potential rebel, and distant observer. Bayezid was left with no actual alternative but to act. He abandoned the prolonged siege of Constantinople, sacrificing years of accumulated strategic pressure, and his most significant ongoing military operation, and began a forced march eastward with his army through the intense heat of an Anatolian July. Imagine the demands of that march. July in central Anatolia brings temperatures consistently above 40 degrees Celsius. The unpaved routes transformed into rivers of dust under thousands of marching feet and hooves. Water sources in the interior were scarce and meticulously managed. An army of 85,000 men and their horses required immense daily water supplies. Locating and managing this water while force marching through hostile territory in midsummer was an immense logistical hurdle, undertaken under duress with no opportunity for rest. Consequently, Bayezid's forces were already exhausted before they even reached their destination. Consider the effort required to secretly move 140,000 men. A force of this magnitude simply cannot disappear unnoticed. It generates noise, dust, disturbed ground, and depleted water sources. Masking this movement demanded active deception, maintaining the appearance of a stationary camp while the main body of the army was already on the move, employing careful route selection to bypass Ottoman patrol zones, and, where possible, moving at night to reduce visible traces. This was as much an elaborate operational deception as it was a movement, and it succeeded completely. Bayezid's reconnaissance units investigated in the wrong directions because Timur precisely anticipated where Ottoman intelligence would focus, and then proceeded through the undetected areas. Then Timur vanished. Bayezid's scouts, ranging ahead, found nothing. Abandoned campsites, cold fire pits, ground disturbed by countless hooves, yet no army. What had transpired? While Bayezid was advancing eastward toward him, Timur executed a complete strategic reversal. He turned his entire force around and drove it southwest, away from the Ottoman advance, utilizing routes that Ottoman reconnaissance was not monitoring. He bypassed Bayezid's army and positioned himself strategically between Bayezid and Ankara. His forces took over the encampments the Ottomans had recently vacated, utilizing the abandoned tents, water supplies, and logistical infrastructure left behind by Bayezid's army as they marched eastward. Timur essentially usurped Bayezid's own position. When the Ottoman army eventually reached the Chubuk Plain, they discovered Ankara still under siege, with Timur's troops situated between them and the city. Their entire eastward journey had yielded nothing but an exhausted Ottoman army and a complete transfer of strategic advantage to Timur. Bayezid found himself outmaneuvered into a forced battle, unable to rest, and facing an enemy on terrain that favored them. This was not due to being outfought, but rather outwitted. Furthermore, there was the critical issue of water. Prior to the confrontation, Timur's engineers had redirected the Chub Creek, the plain's primary water source, into an off-stream reservoir located behind the Timurid lines. The water remained available, but it was now inaccessible to the Ottoman army. If Bayezid's men wished to water their horses and replenish their own provisions, they would have to fight their way through Timur's strongest defensive positions. Thirst was thus transformed into a tactical weapon, with biological necessity becoming a force multiplier for the Timurid defense. Bayezid's generals repeatedly and unequivocally advised him, retreat into the northern mountain terrain, establish a defensive stance in the highlands, compel Timur to pursue you on ground that negates his cavalry advantage and complicates his supply lines. In the intense summer heat, a force of 140,000 spread thin across mountainous terrain would encounter significant logistical challenges. This counsel was professionally sound, directly addressing the specific tactical dilemmas Bayezid confronted. Multiple seasoned commanders advocated for it. Yet Bayezid rejected it, ordering an offensive advance instead. This was not the decision of a foolish individual. It was the choice of a man whose very identity was forged around a particular method of combat and triumph, and who could not conceive of an alternative course of action without abandoning the sultan he had been for 13 years. A sultan defined by lightning-fast attacks. He had always attacked. He would attack again. The trap was sprung. The Chubuk Plain extends through a wide valley north of Ankara, dominated at one end by Katal Hill, a modest ridge that would ultimately become the final Ottoman stronghold by day's end. In late July, the Anatolian steppe appeared yellow-brown and parched, with the heat pressing down like a tangible weight. The dust stirred up by thousands of moving men and horses lingered in the air long after they passed. The men engaged in battle that morning had not adequately drunk since dawn. The water lay on the wrong side of the enemy's front. On the Ottoman left flank, Stefan Lazarević commanded Serbian heavy cavalry, clad in black plate armor, representing the best-equipped soldiers on the Ottoman side of the field. On the right, Prince Suleiman led Anatolian Sipahis and a substantial contingent of Tatar mercenaries, whose loyalty to the Ottoman enterprise was transactional rather than deep-seated. In the center, Bayezid himself was surrounded by the Janissary infantry, the elite slave soldiers who formed the backbone of Ottoman military might. Alongside him, his son, Mehmed Çelebi, commanded the rear guard. On Timur's side, his sons commanded the wings, his grandsons led the vanguard, and Timur himself commanded the center. Anchoring that center, strategically positioned directly in front of the diverted water source, were 32 war elephants from the Indian campaign. These elephants are often depicted as mere exotic details in accounts of this battle, but they were a genuinely effective tactical weapon, and an even more potent psychological one. Horses possess a deep, instinctive fear of elephants, their scent, their sound, their sheer size. A horse that has never encountered an elephant will frequently panic, irrespective of training, because the fear response is hardwired, not learned. Cavalry formations struck by armored elephants would disintegrate as horses scattered and unseated their riders, throwing them against troops who had never faced such creatures, which included every man in Bayezid's army. The psychological impact was magnified by their complete unfamiliarity, and Timur had deliberately placed them directly in front of the water. If the Ottomans wanted the water their men desperately craved, they had to confront these beasts. Timur adopted a defensive posture. He had already completed the strenuous groundwork. His men were rested and well hydrated, while the Ottomans were exhausted and parched. His objective was simply to absorb the Ottoman assault, allow the harsh conditions to wear down the attackers, and await the fracturing of the Ottoman formations. The Ottoman advance began, moving forward onto the plain. Thousands of men marched through the morning dust towards the Timurid lines. The immediate response came in the characteristic form of Central Asian cavalry warfare. Wave after wave of arrows from horse archers who could fire accurately at a gallop, wheel away before engagement, and then return from a different angle against unarmored men or lightly armored cavalry. This barrage of archery proved catastrophic. Ottoman foot soldiers pressed forward through the intense barrage, suffering immense losses before they could get close enough to engage effectively. Thousands fell in the initial clashes, struck down by arrows before they could ready their own weapons. On the Ottoman left flank, Stefan Lazarević led his black-armored horsemen into the fray, and their plate steel served its intended purpose perfectly. Arrows ricocheted off them. The knights withstood the volley that was eliminating everyone else. They closed the distance to where bows lost their efficacy and crashed into the Timurid line with the sheer force of swift, heavily armored cavalry. They pierced through, cleaved a path through the Mongol ranks, and emerged on the opposite side. Stefan turned his contingent back to Bayezid, urging, "Join me. We must break out now. The opportunity is clear." Bayezid responded, "No." On the Ottoman right, the situation was deteriorating in a way that no amount of bravery from Stefan's forces could remedy. Stefan Lazarević's actions at Ankara represent one of the most extraordinary and underrated military achievements in medieval accounts. It stands not merely as a footnote to Bayezid's misfortune, but as a narrative of honor, duty, and commitment to a cause, even when that cause was imposed unwillingly. Stefan was the offspring of Prince Lazar of Serbia, who perished at Kosovo in 1389, the very battle that elevated Bayezid to Sultan. Stefan was approximately 12 years old when his life underwent a complete transformation. His mother, the Dowager Princess Milica, made the calculated decision that most pragmatic rulers in her situation would: adapt or face annihilation. She married her daughter Olivera to Bayezid, thereby making the Ottoman Sultan Stefan's brother-in-law and establishing Serbia as an Ottoman vassal. Stefan was obligated to provide military support when summoned. This arrangement could have resulted in reluctant, minimal compliance, a fulfillment of duty without genuine dedication. However, Stefan proved to be the antithesis. He developed a sincere loyalty to Bayezid, characteristic of a man who held his word sacred, irrespective of how that pledge was originally made. He fought heroically at Nicopolis in 1396. He arrived at Ankara with his elite troops and his unwavering commitment. He neither wavered nor held back. When he pledged, it was absolute. His knights were the best-equipped soldiers on the Ottoman side of the battle. They wore full European plate armor, not the chainmail or partial plate common in Eastern warfare, but complete steel protection covering torso, limbs, and head. This armor was costly, heavy, and crucially, in the context of this battle, it was the decisive tactical advantage for the Ottomans. The scientific principle is straightforward. A composite bow arrow from the Timurids at combat range would penetrate chainmail and most forms of partial armor, but it would not pierce adequate full-plate steel. The knight would still absorb kinetic energy from the impact. A powerful arrow strike can knock a man sideways, but the penetration that causes injury and death is prevented. Stefan's knights could advance despite the hail of arrows that was felling everyone else. This enabled them to execute 3 charges through the Timurid ranks. The first charge successfully broke through. The Timurid forces in their path yielded under the sheer mass and impact of heavy cavalry that could not be halted at a distance. Stefan's men emerged on the far side of the Timurid line, wheeled around, and fought their way back towards Bayezid. The message was unequivocal. Come now, we have proven the path is clear. Gather the cavalry we have and make for the mountains. The second charge also succeeded in breaking through with the same outcome. The escape route is available. Come now. The third charge again broke through. The plea grew more urgent. This window won't remain open indefinitely. The battle around us is crumbling. Come. 3 times, Stefan demonstrated that escape was feasible. 3 times, he returned to the Sultan. 3 times, Bayezid refused. The precise wording of these exchanges is not preserved in any reliable historical accounts. The dramatic dialogues found in popular versions were penned decades later by authors crafting narratives. Yet the core event, Stefan offering, Bayezid declining, is corroborated by multiple independent sources. It happened, and each refusal prioritized the identity of the ruler over the survival of the man. Timur, observing from his central position, reportedly made remarks about the Serbian cavalry that appear in several chronicle traditions. While the phrasing varies by source, the essence remains consistent. The black-armored knights fought with leonine bravery. The supreme commander of the victorious army publicly lauded the soldiers who fought most fiercely against him. The finest warriors on the Ottoman side were Serbian Christians, fighting for a Muslim sultan who had subjugated their homeland. And the man they contended against showed them more open respect than many fighting on his own side. History occasionally presents these instances of profound irony, and they must be acknowledged when they arise. When the battle became irreversibly lost, Stefan organized a controlled withdrawal rather than a chaotic retreat. A contingent of Stefan's soldiers located one of Bayezid's sons. Most historical accounts identify this individual as Musa Chalbi, though some descriptions are less precise. They extracted him from the disintegrating Ottoman ranks before capture became a certainty, secured a significant portion of the Ottoman treasury, and then fought their way through the encirclement using the same successful tactics employed earlier. Their destination was Constantinople. Genoese vessels, provided by individuals who had previously flown Timurid flags from Galata's fortifications as a precautionary measure, subsequently ferried Ottoman survivors across the Bosphorus to the safety of Thrace. Economic imperatives adapt rapidly. Stefan returned to Serbia and continued his reign for an additional quarter century. He oversaw the construction of the Manasya monastery fortress, supported arts and intellectual pursuits, and directly influenced Serbian cultural development. He passed away in 1427. His reputation was enhanced rather than diminished by a battle he technically lost as part of the defeated army. History commemorates him, as it always does for those who exert their utmost effort under insurmountable odds and salvage what they can. This particular aspect of the Battle of Ankara demands your most careful consideration, as it reveals the true lesson, one that extends beyond medieval military history into a fundamental understanding of how power truly operates. The Ottoman army's defeat at Ankara was not due to an overwhelming external force from Timur's troops. Instead, it disintegrated from within, in real time, amidst the ongoing conflict. This internal breakdown was not unforeseen. It represented the predictable outcome of decisions Bayezid had made over more than a decade. When Bayezid expanded eastward in the late 1380s and 1390s, he incorporated the Anatolian beyliks into the Ottoman sphere through conquest and compulsory integration. He militarily defeated them, deposed their rulers, and absorbed their territories directly into Ottoman administration. The men who previously served these rulers, the Sipahis, the cavalry, the local military elite, now served Bayezid. However, service does not equate to loyalty. These men had not willingly chosen Ottoman rule. They had not been persuaded by its advantages or convinced by its ideology. They had been conquered. Their former way of life had been forcibly dismantled around them. They were Ottoman soldiers in an administrative capacity, but lacked any deeper connection to the Ottoman identity, and no amount of time under Ottoman service altered the fundamental nature of their relationship with the empire. Timur recognized this vulnerability and exploited it politically during his Anatolian campaigns in 1400 and 1401. He intentionally portrayed himself as a restorer rather than a conqueror. He contacted surviving members of the dispossessed beylik families, suggesting that restoration under Timurid suzerainty was a viable option. He was not offering absolute freedom, but a more advantageous arrangement than their existing one under Bayezid. He legitimized this offer by demonstrating the military strength to fulfill it. He thus engineered a critical juncture within the Ottoman army even before the battle commenced. During the engagement, this critical juncture was activated. The Tatar contingents on the Ottoman right flank, whose loyalties had always been complex and never fully solidified by Ottoman service, came under intense Timurid pressure. They then made a decisive move, not in disarray or overwhelmed, but as a cohesive unit making a deliberate choice. They abandoned the Ottoman formation for the Timurid side, now fighting against the Ottomans. The immediate tactical repercussions were devastating. Prince Suleiman, commanding the right, suddenly found a portion of his own forces fighting against him. The defensive flank transformed into an active threat from two directions simultaneously. Suleiman's position crumbled. Bayezid diverted Janissaries from the center to attempt to stabilize the right. This thinned the center. The Ottoman formation lost its coherence precisely when it was most needed. Then, the Anatolian Sipahis also began to defect. This was not a synchronized exodus, but a cascading effect. One unit evaluated the situation and concluded that remaining meant certain death for a sultan who had conquered them, whereas departing offered survival and potentially something better on the opposing side. They left. The adjacent unit observed this and made the same calculation. The defections fed upon themselves, each departure weakening the remaining position and influencing the decision-making of the next unit in line. Herein lies the truth that often gets obscured by sanitized historical accounts of this battle. The Ottoman right flank did not collapse because Timur's army was inherently superior. It collapsed because the soldiers within it had never truly committed to the Ottoman cause. Forced integration had created soldiers, but it had not fostered investment. And it is investment, genuine commitment to the outcome, and an earnest belief that what you are fighting for truly matters, that compels men to persevere in a deteriorating tactical situation rather than re-evaluating their allegiances. The principle is strikingly illustrated by the Janissaries, almost with scientific precision. For several hours after the battle was functionally decided, the Janissaries steadfastly defended Cattle Hill. They didn't defect or flee. Instead, they fought with full efficacy, maintaining their formation and discipline until the very end. Their distinctiveness wasn't rooted in training, as the Anatolian Sipahis also comprised seasoned warriors. What set them apart was that the Ottoman system constituted their entire existence. Recruited as boys, they were shaped and utterly defined by it. They possessed no external connections or alternative identities to fall back on. Defeat was genuinely intolerable to them, a sentiment not shared by men whose lives and allegiances predated and would outlast their Ottoman service. An army's reliability directly mirrors the political relationships that forged it. Bayezid had constructed his on conquest and coercion, a foundation that crumbled when a sufficiently formidable alternative emerged. This isn't merely a medieval lesson, it's an enduring truth regarding organizational loyalty, institutional commitment, and the divergence between mere compliance and profound investment. If this kind of in-depth analysis, exploring the why behind the what, appeals to you, please hit the like button. It significantly influences how this channel reaches new audiences. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We consistently offer this level of detailed exploration. Despite betrayals, desertions, collapsing flanks, thirst, exhaustion, and 32 elephants pressing the center, with the battle lost everywhere else, the Janissaries held firm. They retreated to Cattle Hill, established a defensive perimeter on the elevated ground, and maintained their position. Repeated Timurid assaults up the hill were consistently repelled. Encircled, outmanned many times over by forces victorious elsewhere, cut off from water and supplies, and witnessing the breakdown of everything around them, they nonetheless maintained formation and fought with the discipline and effectiveness that made their corps the finest infantry in their world. Multiple accounts indicate they held the hill until after nightfall. I emphasize this because the Battle of Ankara is sometimes portrayed as evidence of fundamental Ottoman military weakness, as if Bayezid's army simply crumbled under severe pressure. The men on Cattle Hill completely refute this portrayal. They had been forced to march across Anatolia during the peak of summer heat. Their water supply had been compromised before the battle started. They had watched their flanks dissolve and their comrades switch allegiance. Surrounded and dwindling in number, they still fought effectively for hours, repelling numerous attacks from a force that held every material advantage. The defeat was absolute and undeniable, but it wasn't because Ottoman soldiers were poor fighters. The Janissaries on Cattle Hill were exceptional soldiers, facing an impossible situation brought about by their sultan's decisions. At some point in the darkness, Bayezid attempted an escape. He gathered the remaining cavalry, a few hundred horsemen, the remnants of what had been a substantial mounted force, and tried to break through the Timurid encirclement under the cover of night, aiming to reach the mountainous terrain to the north. This breakout had sound reasoning. The encirclement was wide. The darkness provided genuine concealment for a small, fast-moving contingent, and the mountains offered ground where cavalry pursuit becomes challenging. For a time, it appeared successful. Bayezid and his escort cleared the immediate battlefield and moved through the forested hills. However, Timur had anticipated this. He had positioned forces in the surrounding mountains before the battle, specifically to intercept any breakout attempt, not as a mere contingency, but as a calculated part of his operation. He had studied Bayezid's tactics and knew that if the battle turned unfavorably, the Sultan would attempt to escape into the terrain rather than surrender on the field. The trap was already laid in the hills before Bayezid even reached the Kubuk plain. The snare extended beyond the battle itself. Bayezid's horse went down, either by an arrow in the dark or due to challenging ground. Sources differ on the exact cause, and I won't feign certainty where the historical record is unclear. But the horse did fall. Bayezid found himself on foot in the dark forest, surrounded. Capture quickly followed. The encounter between Bayezid and Timur is among the most frequently recounted moments in medieval Islamic historiography. Every chronicler offered a version, each revealing more about the author's intentions than about the actual events. However, the dramatic dialogues found in popular accounts, the exchanges concerning destiny, empires, and the capricious wheel of fortune are literary inventions, not authentic transcripts. What we definitively know is the underlying reality beneath this literature. The Sultan found himself captive, a reality Timur was keen to leverage for its political and symbolic impact. The legend of the Golden Cage, which has shaped Bayezid's historical perception for 6 centuries, merits a thorough examination. The widespread notion that he was literally confined in a gilded cage and paraded as a spoil of war appears in several historical records, notably from the Byzantine historian Ducas, and has firmly embedded itself in popular narratives. Conversely, other accounts, some contemporary to the events, depict a situation more akin to an honorable house arrest. Scholarly consensus generally suggests that the cage story became increasingly embellished in its retelling, a potent image that so accurately conveyed the emotional and political truth of Bayezid's predicament that it morphed into a factual event in public memory. Regardless of whether a physical cage existed, the fundamental truth remained. The Ottoman Sultan was Timur's captive, and Timur chose to highlight this rather than downplay it. Beyond dispute and genuinely distressing was the treatment of Bayezid's family during their captivity. Various sources from diverse cultural backgrounds detail the deliberate humiliation of the women of his court in his presence, including his wife, Olivia, sister of Stefan Lazarević. This tactic was a recognized tool of psychological warfare in the medieval era, designed to shatter not merely physical freedom, but also the very core of one's spirit, the sense of self as a protector, a sultan, a man. According to available accounts, it had its intended devastating effect. Bayezid passed away in Timurid custody in 1403, marking the end of his 13-year reign. His military record, which until that fateful summer had seemed almost unparalleled in its consistency, succumbed to illness, compounded by profound grief and the sustained psychological burden of imprisonment and disgrace. The Thunderbolt, the epithet for the man who struck with unforeseen speed and wielded overwhelming force, met a slow demise in a tent, far from his homeland, in his mid-50s. In the days following Ankara, Timur moved with the characteristic swiftness and purpose that defined his campaigns. His forces fanned out across Anatolia, reaping the rewards of their victory: tribute from cities that submitted and devastation for those that resisted. As promised, he reinstated the dispossessed Anatolian emirs. The principalities Bayezid had absorbed over the preceding decade were re-established under their former ruling families, now subservient to Timur. Installing grateful local leaders who owed their positions directly to him was a more efficient strategy than direct imperial administration of a region he intended to eventually depart. He cultivated loyalty through shrewd political calculation rather than sheer force. The Timurid advance reached the Aegean coast. Smyrna, modern Izmir, held by the Knights of St. John since 1344, as one of the last Crusader military strongholds in Anatolia, fell in about 2 weeks. The Knights had maintained this position against various Muslim powers for over half a century, yet Timur conquered it faster than most previous besiegers. Bursa, the original Ottoman capital, was occupied. Bayezid's surviving sons, Suleiman, Mehmed, Isa, and Musa, fled. Each possessed some military resources, a territorial base, and a claim to the succession. However, none was powerful enough to simply assert dominance and secure allegiance, nor were any willing to accept a subordinate role. The empire Bayezid had solidified through 3 decades of relentless personal rule lacked any institutional mechanism for managing succession during a crisis. It had been structured around the singular concentration of power in one individual. And when that individual vanished into Timurid captivity, there was no underlying foundation to bear the weight. The Ottoman interregnum, known as the Fetret Devri, spanned from 1402 to 1413, an 11-year period of civil war across 2 continents. This era was marked by shifting alliances, multiple claimants appearing, gaining an advantage, losing it, being eliminated, and sometimes even reappearing. Byzantine diplomatic intervention, Serbian and Wallachian political maneuvering, and Venetian and Genoese commercial considerations all played a part. The empire contracted, losing significant territory, and administrative coherence in many regions simply evaporated. Suleiman initially controlled the European territories and seemed well-positioned, but he proved politically inconsistent, alienating both the Janissary corps and the Balkan vassals who might otherwise have supported him. He was killed by his own forces in 1411. Isa, militarily the weakest, was eliminated early on. Musa, whose life Stefan Lazarević had saved at Ankara, built a formidable coalition in the Balkans before being defeated by Mehmed. Mehmed I, operating from a base in eastern Anatolia, displayed a patience and political acumen unmatched by his brothers, ultimately emerging as Sultan in 1413. The initial European reaction to the immediate aftermath of Ankara was one of something approaching relief and even celebration. Constantinople's Manuel II, having toured Western European courts for 2 years pleading for military aid that never substantively materialized, finally found a genuine period of reprieve. The enormous pressure from the Ottomans had dissipated. The city was no longer being choked. Byzantine diplomacy reawakened, skillfully leveraging the rival Ottoman claimants against each other, a testament to the agile, resourceful statesmanship characteristic of small, vulnerable nations encircled by powerful empires. Developed purely as a survival tactic. The Venetians and Genoese, observing with commercial acumen, perceived an extended Ottoman civil war as potentially beneficial for trade. In the fragmented political landscape, various competing powers sought Italian ships and commercial proficiency. The Italian city-states manipulated the Ottoman contenders, offering concessions to whichever prince seemed advantageous at a given time, observing the empire's decline with the focused attention of investors monitoring a volatile market. The reinstated Anatolian beyliks quickly learned that nominal autonomy without military backing offered scant protection. Timur had restored their titles, but withheld the means to defend them. Rival Ottoman princes encroached on beylik territory almost immediately following Timur's departure. Some beyliks navigated the interregnum by pitting princes against each other, while others were reabsorbed within a few years. The restoration proved dependent on a Timurid military presence, which vanished upon Timur's death. Timur remained in Anatolia for around a year before heading eastward, never crossing the Bosphorus or advancing into the Balkans. Historians debate the reasons: his genuinely deteriorating health, logistical difficulties, the demands of managing other parts of his vast empire, or perhaps the planned Chinese campaign. Regardless of the combination of factors, he departed Anatolia, leaving it in the hands of the re-established beys and returned home. He died in February 1405 at Otrar in present-day Kazakhstan as he prepared for the China campaign. He was between 68 and 70 years old, having spent most of his adult life in perpetual motion. The conquest of China, which would have been one of the most significant military undertakings in global history had it occurred, perished with him. His empire disintegrated within a generation. Its cultural legacy, the exceptional architecture of Samarkand and Herat, the manuscript tradition, the scholarly and poetic achievements, was authentic, enduring, and magnificent. However, the political and military entity itself essentially vanished within 50 years of its founder's demise. The Ottomans, surprisingly, exhibited remarkable resilience. Mehmed I, the son whose life Stefan Lazarević helped save at Ankara, emerged from the interregnum with a patience, diligence, and deliberate approach that starkly contrasted with his father's relentless expansionism. He consolidated his holdings, mended vassal relationships, and reconstructed administrative systems, proceeding without haste. His son, Murad II, continued this work. Then came Mehmed II, born in 1432, 30 years after Ankara, Bayezid's grandson. In 1453, Mehmed II captured Constantinople. The city Bayezid had been slowly strangling, which Timur had briefly spared, and which had survived due to the Ottoman defeat at Ankara, ultimately fell to Bayezid's own descendant through an artillery assault that its ancient defenses could not repel. The Byzantine Empire ceased to exist. The Ottoman Empire absorbed its capital, and the Sultan who achieved this was the direct heir of the man who had died in Timurid captivity. Timur won the battle. The Ottomans won history. This superficial explanation is accurate but incomplete. Timur possessed more troops, the Ottoman army was fatigued, and some soldiers deserted. All these facts hold true, yet they do not fully account for the profound and total nature of the defeat. When one comprehensively examines the events at Ankara across all dimensions simultaneously, a multi-layered collapse, military, political, strategic, and psychological, becomes apparent, with each layer exacerbating the others. Focusing on any single layer in isolation yields only a partial understanding. The complete picture is far more compelling, insightful, and considerably starker. The first failing was in strategic intelligence. Bayezid's scouts failed to track the movement of 140,000 men across Anatolia. Consider the utter absurdity of this. An army of 140,000 soldiers, along with their horses and supply convoys, moved undetected from one strategic location to another, and Ottoman reconnaissance did not uncover it until the maneuver was already complete. This was not merely a minor scouting oversight, but a fundamental systemic flaw with a specific structural origin. Bayezid had spent his entire reign contending with adversaries who moved slowly. European feudal armies, Byzantine garrison forces, and Anatolian city-states confined to specific territories. None of them operated with the speed of an all-cavalry force. The intelligence apparatus of the Ottoman Empire, while effective for the challenges Bayezid had encountered, was ill-equipped to contend with Timur's unconventional approach. This deficiency wasn't due to individual scouts' shortcomings, but rather a systemic unpreparedness for a fundamentally different type of adversary. The second critical misstep involved Bayezid's tactical choices. Arriving at Ankara with his forces parched and fatigued, he opted for an immediate assault instead of establishing a defensive posture in the rugged terrain, a strategy his seasoned generals strongly advocated. While retreating to the mountains was a sound military proposition, the drive for an offensive was largely driven by emotion, pride, impatience, and an ingrained urge for direct confrontation. This highlights a broader systemic issue beyond individual psychology. Military organizations often foster cultures that promote specific behaviors and deter others. The Ottoman military under Bayezid valued aggression and direct assault, given these tactics had led to significant Ottoman victories for over a decade. Even those who recognized the tactical merit of a defensive stance found it incompatible with their worldview, perceiving it as weak or un-Ottoman. Culture shapes not just leaders' beliefs, but the entire organization's ethos. By 1402, the Ottoman military culture rendered any defensive option psychologically untenable for nearly every member of the command structure. The third and most profound failure was political. The inherent fragility of the Ottoman army was by design, a direct outcome of Bayezid's empire-building strategy, which relied on conquest, forced assimilation, and replacing genuine political bonds with administrative control. The Anatolian Emirates and Tatar contingents that switched allegiances at Ankara acted logically, responding to a shift in incentives. Their allegiance was never truly aligned with Ottoman success. They served under duress, not commitment. When Timur offered a credible alternative, a plausible restoration of their former status, they made a pragmatic choice. Military strength built on coercion crumbles when a sufficiently powerful alternative emerges, and Timur embodied that alternative. The fourth failure, both personal and psychological, is vividly illustrated by Bayezid's repeated rejection of Stefan Lazarević's escape plan. The escape route was demonstrably viable, as Stefan repeatedly demonstrated, and the urgency was undeniable. Each refusal showed Bayezid prioritizing his self-image as an unyielding thunderbolt over his personal safety. This exemplifies identity-protective cognition in its most extreme and destructive form. The rejection of a viable option because accepting it would necessitate a fundamental reevaluation of one's self-concept, even when the rational arguments for such a reevaluation are overwhelming. Retreat would have felt like a form of self-betrayal. The Thunderbolt does not flee. Consequently, the Thunderbolt was captured instead of retreating. Credit goes to Timur for his brilliant water diversion strategy, which demonstrated an understanding of the enemy's fundamental needs rather than merely their troop placements, a level of operational foresight rare among medieval commanders. Sex 1.0. This strategic relocation of forces was a logistical marvel, moving 140,000 men in secrecy through an area not monitored by Ottoman intelligence, demanding exceptional planning and operational security. Furthermore, Timur's political overtures to the Anatolian emirs effectively turned a portion of Bayezid's army into a liability even before the battle commenced. These outcomes were not mere luck, but meticulously planned maneuvers. Timur operated skillfully across tactical, operational, strategic, and political dimensions, whereas Bayezid focused primarily on one. The system encountered the commander, and the system prevailed. In essence, Bayezid's defeat was sealed before his army ever reached the battlefield. The intelligence lapse left him in a disadvantageous position. The political miscalculations rendered his army fundamentally unreliable. The logistical sabotage, through the diversion of water, physically weakened his troops before the first engagement. And finally, his personal obstinacy, his insistence on an offensive advance, and his repeated rejection of escape routes meant that every available mitigating option was actively ignored. While fierce fighting occurred on the Chubuk Plain, leading to the deaths of numerous exceptional soldiers, it largely served as the ratification of a defeat shaped by factors predating and extending beyond the battle itself. Ankara represents a genuine turning point in global history, not just a compelling narrative with historical significance. It was a single day in a specific location where the outcome profoundly reshaped the trajectory of subsequent events, impacts still evident and traceable 6 centuries later. I intend to explore 3 such ramifications, the first being Constantinople's survival thanks to Ankara. By July 1402, the Byzantine capital was undergoing systematic destruction, having endured an Ottoman blockade for years. The city's trade networks, its supply routes, and its connection to the wider world were all being progressively constrained and tightened. Total desperation led Manuel II to spend 2 years traveling across Western Europe, visiting courts in England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire to personally plead for military aid. He received empathy, but virtually no tangible military support. The city was running out of prospects. Then, Timur engaged Bayezid, defeated him, and the immense burden was lifted. This reprieve, while not permanent, lasted for 5 decades. The Byzantine Empire, reduced to little more than the city itself and a scattered few islands, endured until 1453. These 50 years were far from insignificant. Throughout the early 15th century, Greek academics and manuscripts continued to flow westward from Constantinople into Italy, contributing to the Platonic Academy in Florence and facilitating the rediscovery of Greek philosophical and scientific writings that had been lost to Western Europe for ages. The scholars who brought this knowledge west were inheritors of a Byzantine cultural legacy, sustained because of the additional half-century that Ankara had afforded. The impact of this intellectual migration on what we now call the Italian Renaissance, the revival of classical learning that profoundly shaped the genesis of early modern European civilization, is indisputable and profound. Historians studying Renaissance humanism seriously consider this Byzantine link. This connection exists solely due to the events of July 28, 1402. Secondly, what Ankara revealed to the Ottomans about their own nature. The interregnum was devastating and costly. Yet in a way only profound catastrophe can, it was also educational. Mehmet, his successors, and I recognized a truth Bayezid had failed to grasp. Enforced loyalty is not true loyalty. Following the interregnum, the Ottoman devshirme system, which recruited Christian boys from subjugated populations and assimilated them into the Ottoman military structure, was broadened and formalized. This created a dedicated institutional class with an intense personal interest in Ottoman triumph. These were individuals who, like the Janissaries at Ankara, had no alternative identity. The Ottoman system constituted their entire world. This devoted institutional core represented one of the fundamental structural distinctions between the pre-Ankara and post-Ankara Ottoman state. The post-interregnum empire achieved greater political cohesion in ways that were materially significant, exhibiting a keener understanding of the difference between mere compliance and genuine commitment, and investing more in constructing institutional frameworks that fostered authentic allegiance rather than temporary military service. Thirdly, Timur halted. He did not cross the Bosphorus. He did not advance into the Balkans. He had just annihilated the most formidable Muslim military power, separating his armies from Western Europe. And he returned home. The precise reasons remain unknown. His health was failing. His vast dominion demanded his attention elsewhere. The invasion of China was already in the planning stages. Regardless of the combination of motives, Timur's decision not to cross the Bosphorus in 1402 and 1403 is itself a historical event. An unmade choice that allowed the subsequent history of southeastern Europe to unfold along its actual trajectory. And then, the ultimate irony. Timur achieved absolute victory. He seized the opposing sultan, decimated the enemy's army, and dismantled the enemy empire's territorial base in Anatolia. In July 1402, he was the preeminent figure on the global stage, and the living proof of that power was a man in shackles before his tent. 3 years later, he was dead. His empire disintegrated within a single generation. The empire he had shattered reconstituted itself and reigned for another 5 centuries. The Sultan who conquered Constantinople in 1453 was Bayezid's grandson. The statue in the park in Tashkent is of Timur. There is no comforting moral here. It is not simply good triumphing over evil. It is something more profoundly honest. Institutions founded on genuine internal dedication can absorb monumental shocks and recover. Institutions built upon coercion cannot. Bayezid constructed the latter type and believed, until the moment his horse fell in a darkened forest, that he had built the former. The Battle of Ankara is fundamentally a narrative about the chasm between the perceived power one holds and the actual power one possesses. Bayezid spent 13 years forging an empire through conquest and relentless momentum. He was genuinely brilliant at it, undeniably one of his era's most effective military commanders. His record of expansion and military triumph was, by the standards of his time, extraordinary. Yet, none of that served to protect him on the Chubuk Plain, when a more astute strategist exploited the fundamental weaknesses Bayezid had never been willing to scrutinize, because examining them would have necessitated altering the very methods that had propelled him to greatness. And great men, in my historical observation, are often the last individuals willing to undertake such a change. The cage, whether real or a legend, is beside the point. The true humiliation was not the cage. The crushing blow wasn't the cage, but the agonizing instant on Katal Hill, when Bayezid witnessed his forces crumble. It dawned on him then, with devastating clarity, that the loyalty he presumed from his soldiers was never truly his. His empire, founded on the illusion of his unassailable might, always harbored the precise vulnerability that Timur so starkly exposed to the globe. This represents the profound reality of Ankara 1402. If you've watched until this point, I sincerely appreciate it. Creating this material demands considerable effort in research, scripting, and production. Your sustained attention truly makes a difference. Should you find this content worthwhile, please consider clicking the like button. It costs you nothing, yet significantly boosts the channel's visibility to new viewers who might benefit from it. Furthermore, if you haven't already, now is the perfect time to subscribe. We consistently deliver this caliber of in-depth, meticulous, and candid historical analysis with every video. Our next episode is already underway, presenting a narrative you've likely never encountered in this distinct manner. I look forward to sharing it with you.